Hello, today I am continuing my journey into the entertaining, sometimes unusual, but never forgetful world of old Alfa Romeos with this, the 155, a car really of two halves, because on the one hand you could call it the youngest Alfa Romeo that you might term a classic, something that could straddle the line between old enough to be interesting and new enough to be usable. However, on the other, it is also the car often cited with being the beginning of the end for Alfa as a brand for drivers. So then, in the cold light of 2023, which is it? Why has this car been bought by a 24-year-old, and should you follow suit? Find out in today's episode of JM on Cars. Alfa Romeo 155 landed back in 1992, replacing the 75, which was the last car to be constructed whilst Alfa Romeo was still an independent entity. So this, like many others of the time, was based on a car from the Fiat empire. In this case, the 155 sharing many of its major components with the Fiat Tempra and the Lancia Daedra, cars I'm sure we all remember. To distinguish it from its brethren, you have this typical of the time wedge styling, and the 155 is notable for being the last car to look this way. Its successor, the 156, heralding a new age of styling for the company, and one which I think has stood the test of time fairly well. The car I'm driving today, it's owned by a lovely 24-year-old chap called Andy, who has this because it's a car he's always wanted, and he's the sort of interesting young chap that I think the world needs a bit more of because he likes older cars. In fact, this one is actually older than him, and it is his most recent acquisition following a number of both Saabs and Fiats, chiefly the 93 and the Punto. Like many, it was pictures of the old 155 touring cars that attracted him to the model, Alfa Romeo having sent it racing in the 1990s in order to try and pep up its image a bit. Though I'm not convinced it worked as a marketing exercise, as a race car, the 155 did very well, collecting championships in the Italian, German, English, Spanish and European touring car championships. Throughout the majority of the 1990s, the 155s were a force to be reckoned with. And the reason they felt the car needed a little bit of an image boost was because underneath, this was a car that many felt was a step back compared with its predecessor. The big change, of course, being the move from rear to front wheel drive. The sole exception to that was the de facto range topper, the 155 Q4, which featured a drive and powertrain lifted essentially wholesale from the Delta Integrale. So that had 190 horsepower from its 2-litre turbocharged 4, but this, the 2.5-litre V6, though it is the mighty Busso, makes just 166 horsepower. Torque, 159 pound-foot, that's about 217 newton-meters. The car weighs about 1,400 kilos, so expectations of performance to match the noise should be tempered. On that front, I'm sure you've already noticed, this car is not entirely standard. The most obvious bit is that rather loud exhaust, which is the result of a combination of some of the silencers being deliberately removed and then the remaining one essentially gutting itself. So the final item was also removed, which I only found out about last night, and I think I may have succeeded in guilting Andrew to putting something back on it, because this is just way too loud. Certainly too loud for the performance, and to me, just too loud, full stop. Particularly as he doesn't actually drive it all that briskly, I think it just doesn't need to be anywhere near this vocal. The spoiler on the back is actually standard. It's what they call the Silverstone item, and it's got a genuine factory lift kit, which I know looks like somebody has knocked it together in a shed, and they probably have, but it was knocked together in a shed, then put in a genuine Alfa Romeo box, and I'm told it was the last one available. Full stop. The car has also been fitted with a PSG wide body kit, and this is important because in 1995, the year this car was produced, the car was facelifted, and introduced was a new wide body styling across the range. The 2.5-litre V6s I think had always had a slightly wider look about them, but from 95 onwards, all the range got it. This though is not a facelifted car, it is the last of the Series 1s. facelift also brought with it changes to both the steering in the form of a quicker rack and a revised interior, which, to be honest, I do think the car could benefit from. It's not exactly awful in here, but it does feel relatively basic. Most of it works. Most of it. The two electric windows up here work. The rears are manual. There's even a blind in the back which is not electric but still functions as it should. The heater does work, though has now been set so that it's operated by a little red toggle down here rather than the HVAC panel over here. The gauges are largely doing their thing correctly, with the exception of oil pressure, which would be a handy gauge to have working, and the car does feel a little better put together than I was expecting it to. The only real performance modifications, as you might call them, are a set of lowering springs that have dropped the car by 35 mil, so by default it must have ridden really quite high, and a big brake kit, which has been taken from the Fiat Coupe 20 valve turbo. As I have never driven a 155 before, it is difficult for me to tell you exactly what those changes have done. In terms of the brakes, I'm told it's brought a much needed improvement in stopping power. This being a fairly front-heavy car, particularly in V6 skies, the front brakes apparently are just not quite up to the task, and these Fiat Coupe items actually fit the standard factory wheels just about perfectly. I'm quite impressed with that. The ride, less so, because it is, at all points in time, just really firm. Around town it's very bouncy, and even when you've got up to speed, the car is just constantly jittering. This road is not exactly a billiard table, I know it fairly well, but it's better than this, I assure you. That lovely little busso here may not be making all that much power. Typically I drive it in one of its later guises where it made sort of 220 to 250 horsepower, but even here, making 160, actually it makes a better show of itself than you might expect, and you can certainly carry a good amount of speed. The steering rack is certainly slower than I'm used to in many modern Italian cars, but the weighting is far better than I was expecting. This is actually a really nice car to drive. The gearbox, likewise, I thought it would be horrid, but actually it's really good. Now, Andy is not your sort of typical 24-year-old. I'm sure you can tell that by his choice of car. And when he bought this, he was told that it was pretty much sorted. Unfortunately, while mechanically that has turned out to be largely true, in terms of structure, it was not. And he has had to have most of the floor of this car replaced. And I am sure just about nobody is shocked to hear that rust is a problem with old Alfa Romeos. That is likely one of the reasons why today there are so few of them up for sale. In fact, on Auto Trader, they don't have a single one. This is the sort of car you need to head over to either eBay or preferably Car and Classic to find. And there you'll see that prices are still all over the shop, so there are what are almost certainly projects going for around about the £1,000 mark, I'm told, with then the Q4 in nice condition going for 15 to 20 grand if it's a seller that's got a good car and a buyer that's willing to pay a high price. The majority, of course, are sat somewhere in the middle, and I'm told you can get a decent, usable, if not pristine example of a V6, which for me is always going to be the one to have, for sort of, well, let's just call it 5 grand. And at that price, it's a car that makes a fair bit of sense. As a young man, I was always obsessed with rear-wheel drive, and it's one of the reasons why this, the 156, and a whole bunch of other Alfa Romeos were simply never ever cars that I lusted after. They looked pretty for sure, had a 6-cylinder engine, made a good noise, but as far as I was concerned, I'd been indoctrinated and rear-wheel drive was better. To some extent, that is an opinion that I hold still today, but when you're talking about a car like this that has the power level that it does, I think it's a lot less of an issue. First off, by being front-wheel drive, it gives you a very usable boot. Something like 500 odd litres, which for a car of this size is very impressive. You've also got plenty of room inside. In fact, you could fit 4 good-sized adults in here, which is not something I can say of even the 166, a much later and larger car that I drove the other day. In fact, fact, as a driving experience, this is also way better than that. It's still not the grippiest thing out there. That might have a little bit to do with the tyres, but actually the chassis and engine, they all seem to match each other fairly well. No one element seems to stand out. I think I might have heard the tyres scraping there. This suspension I definitely would change. Oh, and the arches scrape back there as well, and I think I might be able to smell a little bit of rubber having caught. Handily, if this does turn into a bigger problem, there is a fire extinguisher down here that was fitted when Andy went to the Festival Italia at Brands Hatch and saw just how many old Italian cars were brandishing one. Don't forget, if you're thinking of a fire extinguisher for your car, to use my discount code for the good people over at Fire Safety Stick. This steering's really good. I mean, I'm not carrying masses of speed through this bend, but the steering, the gearbox, oh, they're nice. I'm not a fan of this fabric-y interior, which is just really off for me in an Alfa Romeo. This should be leather or something a little bit more exciting, but well, I guess it is an older car, and this is one of the ways you really feel it. The dash actually is doing a pretty good job. You can tell everything you need to know fairly quickly, and other than this bit down here not working quite as it should, and I'm told crying wolf when it comes to the oil light, is it's okay. If it worked well, it would be good enough. The reason the window is open, by the way, is because I think the aircon's not working, so yeah, getting a bit of fresh air in the cabin. Let's try those brakes. No, they're really good. In terms of modulation, if not outright power, they're fantastic, and to be honest, from the size of them, I think they should be able to stop you in most conditions. I'm really impressed with this car. Gotta say, I had concerns earlier that it would just be both horrid to drive and also a little bit sketchy, because this can often be the case when young people buy older cars like this, because there'll often be a lot wrong with them and they'll be happy to do mods but not happy to maintain them. Not the case with this, and he should be very proud of this. Less so the exhaust, but he knows that already, and the suspension I'd fettle as well. I'm sure there's a way to get it looking cool without compromising the ride quite so much. But though I can see exactly why people look down upon this, particularly Alfisti, as really the beginning of the end, from today's perspective, I actually think it's a really nice, enjoyable car with very distinctive looks. I'd always go 156 myself, but you're not likely to mistake this for much else out there. You're certainly not going to think you've just spotted a 3 Series. And he says it gets a lot of attention, of the right kind, I expect, mostly, other than probably when he's trying to get to work at 5 o'clock in the morning. The cats are still in place, so it's not like the car has been entirely straight piped. It's just a bit fruitier than it needs to be. The 155 did technically get a GTA version, as you found with the later 156 and so on. However, I think it was essentially a one-off, a car that allowed them to go racing with some very tasty modifications, a bit like the M3 GTR. The Q4, I think, is always going to be the collector's choice, but for somebody looking for a more usable, interesting car that's likely to be a little easier to keep going, the V6, I think, is a fabulous thing, and you cannot deny that when properly silenced, the noise of the Busso is one of the all-time greats. And as a cool car for a young person, which between this, his Saab and his Fiat costs only £1,200 a year to insure, I think he's onto a good thing. And though I could totally understand why anybody in period would have gone and bought a C-Class, a 3 Series, or even a Volvo or something like that instead, today, the 155 for me is just a cool old Alfa. And happens to be a pretty usable one too. That'd never get old either. And to be honest, I could have a copper following me, and though they might not like the noise too much, you're not actually going fast enough to really be that much of a problem. In fact, as young people's cars go, I think this probably has a little bit more chassis and brake than it does engine, and so that's probably a good thing. The front-wheel drive there then will also be a bit of a safety aid, because if things do get a little bit squirrely, it's going to do so in a far less dramatic fashion than were it rear-wheel drive. So all round, while I will admit that I have my concerns, and then in a bend like this, that steering just weights up, does start to talk to you. It's a really nice car, this. Yeah. Alfa 155. I like it. A lot. So then, that's all I've got to say on the matter. A big thank you to Andy for bringing the car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.